Please welcome to the stage Ambassador Paula Dobriansky of the Harvard University Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and Ambassador Robert O'Brien of American Global Strategies.
Well, welcome, Ambassador O'Brien. We're going to have an exciting discussion this afternoon on the global hotspots. But let me say good afternoon to all of you. You're in for a real treat because in our 20-minute span, we're going to cover quite a bit. And you're lucky indeed to hear from someone who has really been in all parts of the world and really has so many different kinds of contacts with different parts of societies abroad and the US government and past, present, and we're going to dive right in with Ukraine. So, Ambassador O'Brien, you were the 27th National Security Advisor of the United States, and you know, you've dealt extensively with Ukraine, with Russia, with China, but let's go right to Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine. How can Ukraine succeed? How can it succeed? What must we do? And you got 2 minutes for that answer.
Well, the first thing I'll say, I was the 27th National Security Advisor, but I'm here with the youngest director at the NSC in history. I think you were 24, Paula, when you were there?
I was 24, I was in the Reagan administration, and if I could say something about Ambassador O'Brien, and you know what that is? He is one of the strongest proponents of one of Reagan's mandates, peace through strength.
Yeah. So that gets us to the Ukraine question. How does Ukraine win? Ukraine wins by winning, and we can help Ukraine win. And we have been so far. We're the arsenal of democracy. In the Trump administration, and I've got some of my former colleagues here. I see Julia there in front. Neshwat, who was also a senior director at the NSC. Look, we got them the Javelin missiles. That was something that hadn't been done in the prior administration, because we knew we had to get them some defensive weapons, more than Gatorade, more than MREs, more than blankets, so they could deter the Russians and ultimately defeat the Russians if they needed to. So that initial three-prong armored attack, the three axes that came in, that was blunted by the javelins that we got them. Now, I want to give the Biden administration credit, and I always try to when they do something that's positive. They did a good job rallying the American people and making sure that the American government was able to get the Ukrainians the weapons and platforms they needed to defend themselves. But it's been a little bit slow. We can get the Ukrainians more. But I will say, for Ukraine to win, it's got to be a whole of an alliance approach. It can't just be the United States. We need Germany, we need France, we need the UK, which has done a pretty good job, Poland, the Czechs. And right now, I think we put $150 billion into aid to Ukraine. The Europeans are somewhere around $30 billion. We can't care more about European security than the Europeans care about it. So we need some hard-nosed diplomacy, and this is something the Biden administration struggles with. They have a hard time pushing our European allies. They so much want to be liked by our European allies. And look, I want to be liked. I like Europe. I want to go to Europe and be warmly received as well. But we need to put pressure on the Europeans to do their part for Ukraine, because we can't do it alone.
Let's go to Russia. You know, one of the arguments has been that, well, we can't push too hard in Ukraine because of fear of escalation. Putin, we know, has come out and he's, you know, been waving nuclear weapons and threatening not just the United States, but the West at large. But that hasn't happened. Should we be concerned about this particular threat of escalation and the usage of nuclear weapons? What's your view on that?
Well, Paul, my thought is, look, we've got to be concerned about nuclear weapons. That was my concern every day. I had the backup football in my office in a safe. The president had a military that had the football with him, that had the codes and the plans to respond to a nuclear attack. And probably the most sobering briefing you get in the National Security Council and as National Security Advisor, or if you're read into the program, is what would happen if there was a nuclear attack on the U.S. And it's an incredibly sobering briefing, and very few people receive it, and it would be devastating. There's no winning a nuclear war. So,
but should that stall us or prevent us from giving Ukrainians the kinds of equipment that they're requesting?
No, we can't give them to nuclear blackmail. Absolutely not. If we did, the Chinese and Russians would have their way around the world in any conflict. So we've got to be concerned about escalation, but we can't be unduly concerned about it. And look, the Russians are smart people too. Vladimir Putin wants to be the richest man in the world. He wants to be a new czar. He doesn't want to see Russia destroyed in a nuclear event, and just like we don't want to see America or the West destroyed in a nuclear event. So we had a policy of deterrence for many years in the Cold War. It worked. It's still working. I mean, we're going to have to rebuild our nuclear triad because of what China's doing with their 1,000 new nuclear missile silos in China. But I think the Russians are going to be deterred by our strategic deterrent. We're deterred by theirs. And, I think we can support Ukraine without worrying about the Russians launching a first strike attack on us by supporting Ukraine.
And let me ask you another one. Some are arguing that, well, Russia may break up, and we need to be concerned about that. Do you see that happening as a result of this brutal Russian invasion in Ukraine?
Look, I don't see it happening, but we had a break with the Soviet Union. That was good for America. And if Russia broke up and some of the ethnic republics in Russia had their own say, I mean, that's what Woodrow Wilson talked about in the Versailles, the idea of national self-determination. So if some of these Russian states didn't want to be part of Russia, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. Now, I'm not advocating for a breakup of Russia. I'm not advocating for regime change in Russia. But again, it's one of those kind of boogeymen that people put out there that we shouldn't support Ukraine because somehow Russia might break up and that would be lead to catastrophe. I don't think we should be put off from defending our democratic allies and partners because Russia might break up. I mean, that's not persuasive to me.
Let's go to China. You have been on a number of media outlets and talking about China and the threat posed by China. And one of your, I think, very significant and standout statements, you've said that the United States is not prepared for a conflict with China. Tell us about that. This is an important area.
Well, the threat of the Chinese Communist Party is the greatest threat we've ever faced as a nation. Perhaps going back to our founding when we faced the superpower of Great Britain in the Revolutionary War. The Chinese are a very well-organized society. They've got an ideologically driven government. This is not an authoritarian regime. It's not a junta. It's not some leader. This is a Marxist-Leninist country that has a strong ideological doctrine and a communist party of a couple 100 million that's committed to world domination. And they want to change our way of life. They don't just want to change the way of life of the Chinese people and dominate the Chinese people. They want to take away our rights. They want to take away our First Amendment rights, our right to free speech, our right to freedom of association, the things that we hold dear here. And so it's a huge challenge for us. And they've got a huge economy. They've spent a dramatic amount of money on their military buildup. The Navy, we haven't seen a naval buildup like the Chinese naval buildup since Kaiser Wilhelm built the Kriegsmarine to try and displace the Royal Navy before World War I. The Chinese Navy is now bigger than the American Navy. And they're putting out a destroyer or a frigate a month. We're doing 1 or 2 a year. So it's, we're going to, our kit may be better quality, and I think it is, but at some point quantity, as Stalin said, has a quality all of its own, and we're not prepared. The Chinese have hypersonic weapons. We don't, because that program was killed during the Obama administration because we were never going to have another war. We got it restarted, and we're going to deploy hypersonics this year, but again, we're behind, and the Chinese are way ahead of us. They're building a bigger Navy. And they're plowing forward. I mean, they're even with the economic trouble they're facing, they're moving forward with their military buildup like the Soviets did back in the 60s and 70s.
Well, the military and security aspect is key, and I think your statement points to how we should be more vigilant. On the trade side, there's this debate about de-risking or decoupling. What's the right term and what's the right policy that we should be pursuing in dealing with China?
Well, look, I've never been against trade with China. We should sell China things, and they should buy it and pay us. And we should, if there's things that China has to sell to us, there's no reason we shouldn't buy and sell it, as long as it's fair trade. But what's happened, Christopher Wray talked about this, the director of the FBI. The intellectual property theft of China from America and the West has been the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. And so that caused me to think about the Trajan column in Rome with, it shows all the ox carts full of the loot from Dacia that Trajan brought back to Rome and kept the empire going for another 200 years with all the loot he got from Romania. But the point is, they've done the same thing to us. And they steal American innovation. And that doesn't just deprive the inventor of license fees and patent fees and income. They then build the same product, and then they dump it back here at a lower price and put the original entrepreneur, the original investor, the original inventor out of business. And they destroy the businesses, and then China dominates that industry. And they've been doing this for years. They've hollowed out the middle of this country. And So we need to have we can't, we tried at the beginning of the Trump administration to do a phase 1 trade deal. As President Biden said today, we needed the Chinese to observe the rules of the road. We thought maybe we could do that with some tariffs and some tough negotiating. We got a good deal, and then the Chinese promptly violated it. They are not interested in fair trade. They're interested in a mercantilist system in which they win, we lose. And so I think ultimately, and Bob Lighthizer, our great USTR, who's probably the best negotiator the government's ever had, told me recently, we were on a show together, he said, look, I'm for decoupling now. I didn't used to be, but I'm for decoupling. And I think I'm in the Lighthizer camp now because the Chinese will not play by the rules of the road, and they're not interested in fair competition. And to believe otherwise, I think, is naive at this point.
Right, let's go to Iran. Just breaking news the other day was the release of American hostages from Iran. And you, Ambassador O'Brien, you had the position at the Department of dealing with American hostages worldwide. And you dealt with many, many countries and really worked very, very hard. And you had some very important successes in that regard. What was your reaction in seeing this? On one hand, I'm sure you were gratified to see the release of our Americans, but what does this mean about U.S. policy towards Iran? How did this happen, and does this connote some new path forward?
Well, the first thing I'll say, and I always say this, I welcome the return of the American hostages. They've been held for many years. Several of them, Murad Tabaz and Siamak Namazi, were there when I was hostage envoy, when I was national security advisor. Mm-hmm. And I worked very hard to get them out, and we didn't get them out, unfortunately. And I was heartbroken when I left office that I had to tell their families that at least on my watch, on President Trump's watch, their loved ones weren't coming home. But we did get 3 other hostages home from Iran. We didn't pay a dime of ransom. And what concerns me about paying ransom, and this is a real problem, is when you pay ransom, you put a price on a blue passport. And right now the price is $1 billion per. So if you're overseas and you're a rogue government or a terrorist organization, a JNIM or Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and you just saw the American government pay $1 billion per for an American, why wouldn't you, as just a rational policy decision, take an American hostage? Because even if you got 10% of it, it's still 100 million. And so you create a market for hostage taking, you encourage hostage taking diplomacy, and you transfer the misery of the current hostages to some future hostages and future families. So that's number one. But then the second thing is, anytime you give a rogue actor, a terrorist organization or a terrorist regime, and Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism, has been for many years, when you give them money, you have to wonder, what are they going to do with that money? Mm-hmm. And if they use that money, and money is fungible, and the Iranian president has already said he'll use the money any way he damn well pleases, he's not going to abide by the agreement that he made. Now, this is not going to chemotherapy for children in Tehran Children's Hospital. It's going to go to drones that are going to kill Ukrainians every day. It's going to go to rockets that are going to kill Israelis. It's going to go to Hezbollah and Kataib Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iraq and kill our partners. It's going to go to the Houthis in Yemen. It's going to go to the brutal Assad regime. So not only are we creating a market for hostages by giving $6 billion for them, we're also giving money to a regime that's going to use it to kill people. So people are going to die as a result of this money that we've paid, or released. It really doesn't, it's distinction without much of a difference. And so it's very bad policy. And what it means for Iran is, look, I think this administration is desperate for a deal with Iran. The JCPOA was the crowning achievement. It was the Abraham Accords of the Obama administration, although I think it was a Munich moment. I thought it was terrible. And I think time showed that it was a terrible deal, that all the money, all the relief that the Iranians received from sanctions didn't go to the Iranian middle class or Iranian poor people. It went to sponsor terrorism and the nuclear program. But they want to restore that to President Obama. And I think this is a step they're taking in that direction to encourage the Iranians to come back to the table, to get back into the JCPOA. And I think that's harmful to American interests.
Thank you for your answer on that. And also thank you for not only your service as National Security Advisor, but when you were spearheading the hostage effort, you did have a number of cases that you had resolved, but you've sustained that interest. And just thank you for your service in that regard.
No, it's an honor of a lifetime, Paula.
Well, that means so much to Americans and the American families involved, but all Americans. Let me ask you, since we're on Iran, not to move away from the region yet, there was the recent deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which the Chinese had brokered. What do you make of that? What does that mean for the United States?
Well, look, I think we were heavily involved in the Middle East and have been for the last, since Ibn Saud met with Franklin Roosevelt on the deck of an American cruiser. And we've had a strong relationship with the Middle East, and we played the role of honest broker. You think of the great names of diplomacy, Philip Habib and Henry Kissinger and all the folks that, we worked with when we were younger. America has had the preeminent role as being the peacemaker, as being the power broker, as being the protector of our allies. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was the U.S. that led the coalition to defeat Iraq and keep this principle of sovereignty of nations. A bigger nation can't just invade a smaller nation because it can, because it wants to take over. We're seeing that in Russia and Ukraine today. But we forfeited that over the last several years. We went from great successes of the Abraham Accords, healing the Gulf Rift, which we did in December of 2020, even after the election. The rift between Qatar and Saudi and UAE and Egypt.
And you had the Abraham Accords.
We got that done. We got the
on your watch.
Abraham Accords done, and many other things happened in the Middle East. That's now been forfeited because we gave the impression that we were leaving the Middle East, and so for our partners and friends there who are concerned about their own security, the Saudis, especially looking over the Gulf at Iran, and seeing the attempts to appease Iran, the attempts to get back into the JCPOA, Rob Malley's diplomacy of doing whatever it would take to get the Iranians back to the table. The Saudis looked at that and said, well, that's not good for us. The Americans aren't going to be here for us. Let's reach out to the Chinese. They're a pretty big boy on the block, and maybe if we do a deal with them, China will put us under their security umbrella. And so we've not only, we're not only empowering Iran, but we're letting China into the region to play the role of a power broker in an important region in the world. So it's kind of a double loss for America.
The ambassador and I share a number of interests, and I could ask briefly about North Korea, maybe I will, but I also want to go to one that we share, and that's the Arctic. What should be our policy towards the Arctic? We're very concerned about it, with the Russians having built bases there, the Chinese, of course, keenly interested in the Arctic passageway. What should be our policy? And you worked very extensively on this in your watch.
Yeah, the policy is, number one, look, we can talk all we want, but our adversaries and our partners look at what we do on the ground, or in this case on the water. And we've got one icebreaker that's available for half the year. And the Russians have 50 icebreakers. So if we don't get some icebreakers up to the Arctic soon, we're going to be in real trouble. We're going to lose the battle before it ever starts. And we've got a couple that are being constructed, but in typical U.S. shipbuilding fashion, it's taken a long time. Julia Neshwat, who's here, negotiated the lease of 2 commercial icebreakers that we're going to paint white and put an orange racing stripe on and put a few 50 cals on and get them up there. Unfortunately, those icebreakers are no longer for lease, and they're not up in the Arctic, but we need to get icebreakers to the Arctic right away.
We absolutely do, and as I said, on your watch, you really worked that very hard. Let me, as you're taking a sip and realizing we have 2 minutes left, we have 2 questions for you. North Korea. How should we handle North Korea? The 6-party talks, that were for decades didn't work. No, President Trump tried to reach out and, engage personally. And here we are, and now the leader just made a visit to Moscow. How can we engage? I mean, how can we influence, not engage so much, but influence?
The optics for that visit of Kim Jong-un to Vladimir Putin were so bad, and they were hanging over the side of the missile launching silo. It looked like a Bond villain, reunion. And look, North Korea's bedeviled Republican and Democrat presidents, for the past 30, 40 years. It's a sealed off hermit kingdom. We've put massive sanctions on them, maximum pressure, Republicans and Democrats, and yet they're always on the verge of starvation, and yet they're able to pump out nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. I mean, it shows how industrious they are as a people and how ingenious they are. We had a good plan in the Trump administration. Kim Jong-un wanted to talk to us. We pulled him away from Beijing and away from Moscow a little bit and had him engaged. There were no nuclear tests, no ballistic missile tests over Japan. And unfortunately, he's now back in the arms of Russia and Beijing.
Well, and that's where that is. Well, I have a final question for you. And that one is a personal one. You just did an interview with Hugh Hewitt. And if any of you did not see it, Hugh Hewitt made an announcement. He asked Ambassador O'Brien, are you going to run for the Senate of Utah? as senator from Utah. So we're here in Concordia. We'd like to make news. What is the real answer here? Tell us.
As I told you, one of the nice things about moving to Utah from California is as a Republican, and I love California, but we've got a great bench of Republican leaders in Utah. There'll be a great Republican senator from Utah. He or she won't be named O'Brien. Not the right time for me and my family, but we'll look for opportunities to serve otherwise and still speak out on the issues like we are here at Concordia. But there'll be a great Republican senator from Utah. It just won't be me.
Well, we're looking toward a great future, political, government service, private sector from you as you go forward. But Concordia is really thrilled that you took the time today to cover these hot spots, and we did it in the 20 minutes. Amen. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Robert O'Brien.
Thank you, Paula. You're a great American.